Resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Within my own time allotment, I have 15 minutes, and I understand my friends will grace me with 5 more if I need it, but I'm hoping to finish within my own time. So carrying on, Mr. Mermark, with Table 5.2-1, I'm just about finished with the first box there, but there's something that you pick up in both the first box and the next box that I have to say had many of my clients and their technical advisors scratching their heads a little, and it's this concern, as you know, that are probably are familiar, the debate going into the wild salmon policy had government and stakeholders having a lot of discussions about on what level and scale management should be occurring, and the wild salmon policy came down to conservation units and the work associated with conservation units. You're suggesting something a little different in this, you might be, I'm not sure, this strategically selected cross-section of stocks. You use those words. You don't describe them in your report as to what you're after, and so I'm curious, is this a budgetary concern? Is this a management concern? Where are you going and what were you intending with that? Because we're hoping not to continue a historical debate about the importance of biodiversity.
So the question comes back to the breadth versus depth of evidence that one is able to have. And so, you know, for example, you could get a great breadth of evidence for all 36 conservation units with a very shallow depth. Or at the other extreme, you know, you could have 5 stocks that you studied very intensively. Okay, and so what we were saying here is strategically selected cross-section of stocks with varying conditions, so migration distance levels and types of watershed disturbance. So essentially, you try to take a sample, and this would include a range of sizes of stocks and a range of strengths of stocks, like not just the big ones, so that you're able to have some depth of evidence for that subset rather than spreading yourself too thin. So if you had an infinite amount of money, yeah, you could have all the information on all the conservation units, but you're not going to, I don't think it's very likely you're going to have that.
Let's assume we won't.
I think that's a safe assumption.
That's a good one, I think.
So that's the rationale.
All right, and so it's fair to say that if we wanted to make sure this research was as useful as possible, the selection of this strategically selected cross-section of stocks would need to be done by a broad spectrum of managers and stakeholders. Is that correct?
Yes, looking at a wide variety of objectives.
Okay. All right, then with those 2 questions, I think I can now move down to the section on downstream migration to the estuary. And here, I'm just more curious about helping you to understand your relevance to management actions as high. I appreciate that understanding the survival rate of smolts during the downstream migration could be quite useful for explaining the overall trends and where we have, and perhaps even the reduction in overall productivity. So I was curious that you thought it was only medium because it might be a bottleneck, but as it relates to relevance to management actions, is your conclusion that it's high based on the assumption that if we did learn that it was a bottleneck, that there would be active steps to minimize pollution or other habitat issues during this component of the life cycle?
Yes, that's correct. Or like you say, pollution issues or perhaps disease issues. So for example, at the Mission trap, smolt trap, you could collect bunch of smolts, analyze their contaminant body burdens, analyze them for disease, do genetic stock identification. That might be a good sort of screening kind of approach to detect problems, particularly say as temperatures go up, or if there are certain stocks that do have delayed density dependent effects, you might be able to detect that earlier.
And then the question would be, what could we do about them? That's the relevance to management. But again, you're dealing there with what we could do with it there as a habitat protection issue.
For the case of contaminants, it would be a habitat protection issue. In the case of disease, it would depend on what the causes of that were. So if you found out that diseased fish were more likely to come from fish that from stocks where they had greatly exceeded their escapement, that would suggest one direction. You could go look more closely at those stocks to try to understand them better. You could also help to eliminate that hypothesis as well. So I think it just is a screening tool for a variety of potential actions.
Great, that's helpful to understand. Let's move on then to the coastal migration, which you've rated as high for explanatory importance and high for management activities. And I just want to unlock some of the 9 to 13, for example. And let's just start with some of the easier components. Number 10 and number 13 seem identical to me, with the exception that you've mentioned Harrison Lake in 13. But otherwise, what we're talking about is really trying to get the residency and migratory path of the Fraser River sockeyes post-smolts, including Harrison Lake. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
All right, and then as it relates to number 9, one of our observations is this would be a wonderful study, but it might take all of DFO's budget for research for the next little while to complete number 9. Am I correct that the number 9 is a potentially expensive approach to management? Maybe I'm not seeing it right, or?
I think this comes back to, and we don't have to flip back there because we've already talked about it earlier, but some of the questions, or let's say the process by which we would prioritize and further characterize exactly what you would do here, which is outlined on page 107. And so what the first question there is, how exactly will the information be used? Okay, so number 9, if you were to try to get a complete fundamental understanding of everything that's happening in all of those places, could be a lot of dollars. If your intent was to say, let's try to understand well what the potential effects are on returns 2 years hence, and say whether things are likely to be lower than expected, higher than expected based on the number of spawners in the parent generation, that defines a different level of information, which perhaps wouldn't cost as much money. So being an applied ecologist rather than an academic one,
Yes.
my approach is to outline, so how will the information be used and what's intended uses, and then think about what's the level of resolution that's appropriate, right? So I often use the term bicycle, Volkswagen, or Cadillac,
Yep.
and maybe Cadillac's going extinct now, so, but what level is required?
Right,
to answer
okay,
the
so
question?
in fact, paragraph 9 really needs that qualification when you say a fully integrated oceanographic and ecological investigation. And don't get me wrong, my clients would love that, but we're a little bit worried about whether we'll be able to fund it. But what you want to do is make sure that number 9 is very keyed to the research question that's being asked.
Actually, that's true for all of these
them,
recommendations.
Yeah. All right. Would you agree, and we had this dialogue earlier, that a companion to number 9 is the marine use planning that I referenced you to? Because if we're really going to get down to understanding this, once we learn this, we're going to have to figure out what we can do about it and where the sensitive areas are and any of those. So I agree that the relevance to management actions is high, but the management actions we have in the marine are pretty well habitat protection. Would you agree with me on that?
No, I think that's a reasonable inference as you find out more about where the stressors are and look at what you can do about them. Then the logical sequence is to manage your activities accordingly, assuming that you can.
Right, and so we would need to know where the, as you call them, bottlenecks or stressors are, and determine what we can do about that. And so it might be useful to make sure we're doing that at the same time as any of the larger studies.
No, that's reasonable.
Thank you. Then let's,
Or yes, that's reasonable.
okay. Let's go on to growth in the North Pacific and return to Fraser. You've put that as relevant to the explanatory is medium, and the relevant to management actions is low. And I just, when I was reading that, I was hearkening back to listening to Randall Peterman and his evidence, and particularly the potential interaction that he saw in his population dynamic work between international production of pinks and fish farms and climate change, and the interaction between those three. And so given that from his work, that was his caution and that concern to the group of us that are helping the commissioner wade through all of this. Would you agree that relevance to management actions may not be low? It may actually be necessary to take some fairly strong management actions as it relates to international work.
This is a little tricky to follow, but I don't disagree with the points you just raised with respect to factors that may be important, like variation in pinks and potentially fish farms. With respect to fish farms, as we talked about earlier, I think the main focus is on the coastal migration stage and trying to get specifically recommendation 11 dealt with. With respect to competition from pinks and hatchery pinks, the work that Greg Ruggiero and others have done, I mean, you can get at those questions based on spawner recruit analyses. You don't need to go out and do open ocean research to get at those questions. The only part, I mean, at least in terms of effects on recruitment, he has done work in the Gulf of Alaska on effects of pinks on growth of salmon at sea. So in years, it's odd even years, I can't remember which way the story goes, but in the years where you get more pinks, you end up having less growth of Bristol Bay sockeye. And that was, you know, getting information at sea. So I think you can draw inferences based on returns rather than having to do detailed studies out in the North Pacific.
Yeah, the concern more is that you rated it low, and given the goal, the low to management actions. And
but I'm rating low open ocean research. I think what may have been misleading here is that, and I can understand why you would draw this conclusion, is I think you can improve your understanding of competition of some pink sockeye interactions without actually having to do work in the North Pacific. There's other pink sockeye interactions like growth, maturity, and overwintering survival, which would require going out there. So it's a question again of, is this a Volkswagen or a Cadillac that you need in order to address the question?
All right, but the management
It's probably not
actions,
going to be a bicycle.
the management actions could be quite relevant. The management.
Yes, that's true. The management actions could be quite relevant, so that's fair that the ultimate response to that information could be medium or, yeah, depending on how you argue it. That's fair.
You'll agree, of course, that the assessment of high to relevance to management action is that one of our strongest management actions is to decide when and where we're going to fish. Correct?
Yes. Can we just move to the next page? Sorry. Thanks, Mr.
I'm curious about number 19, and I'm just wondering, 20 wasn't given a bold, and it seems to me that management strategies to maximize the potential for persistence under stress from climate change is going to be very interactive with any kind of modeling on climate change. Would you agree with that?
You know, one of the problems with this table, I think it's interpreted to mean that the bold ones are the only ones we're recommending. That's not the intent of the table. The intent of the table is to say the bold ones we'd like to make sure definitely get attention, and the other ones should also get attention. So it's not as though climate change modeling is still important. Somewhere along the line you're going to have to make some choices, and different groups would probably bold different parts of this table. So this is our first recommendation at it, but we suspect that if you went through that process you were describing earlier, that might come out differently. You know, for example, that paper that you referenced earlier by Martins et al. Did some climate change modeling. I think the thing there is that we know something about what kind of temperature changes might occur. Doing a lot more climate change modeling isn't going to gain us a lot more inferences on that. What's probably more challenging and what's the greater uncertainty is, so what can you do about these temperature increases? Can you create cool water refugia? You know, or what other things, which stocks are most critical to preserve and so on. I think that's a greater level of uncertainty, so that's why we bolded that one.
Okay, so there's two things that follow up on that what can we do question. The first one that I wanted to pursue with you is that given all of the work that you've done in summarizing these multiple stressors, and given that climate change is neither predictable in terms of our coast, as Skip McKennell was very good to remind us, or even Dr. Beamish when he said we have to expect the unexpected as it relates to that. Would you agree that the opening and closing and placement of fisheries in response to a returning stock is going to ever increasingly need to be precautionary?
I would agree with that.
And that we will need to take very additional care in trying to understand exactly the strength of the run within a mixed stock fishery.
Yes, of the multiple stocks that are co-migrating.
I need to take a couple of minutes to talk about migration back to spawn, and particularly your comments on en route mortality and pre-spawn mortality. Hoping I can do this without taking you back to your report, but I don't have any difficulty with that. When describing the declining trend, you were careful in your analysis to say we don't have to examine the correlations between en route mortality and life cycle or post-juvenile productivity because that's already included in the management. But you'll agree with me that en route mortality and the relationship between disease or other stressors in en route mortality could very much be direct causative.
Of what?
En route mortality may be caused by multiple stressors or the exposure to disease.
So en route mortality appears to be caused from the work that Tony Farrell and others have done, most particularly by the higher temperatures and the stress that causes to various stocks. And associated with higher temperatures are also various diseases, and the work that Christy Miller's done has shown some correlation between those fish that have genomic signal and those that die during en route mortality, although, as you've discussed already in other hearings, the exact disease isn't known. So, but I think that the big issue is the change in temperatures. That's the key driving factor. The change in temperatures in the Fraser River as those fish are moving up.
Fair to say it's one of the most overt things that we can see is the driving temperatures. We know sockeye is very sensitive to temperature, so we can see that it's an overt measurement that we have, but we don't know the subtle interplays.
No, we don't know the subtle interplays, and it's complex. At the PSC workshop, which was in 2010, Dr. Miller presented evidence saying that the outgoing smolts in 2008 had a high proportion of them also showed that genomic signal, and yet we had really good marine survival. So the fact that you have genomic signal, it may be that that's just the weaker portion of the population. If they hit a good ocean, they do fine. If they hit a lousy ocean, they die. Or en route mortality.
I'm sorry. I'm getting the nod, so I think I can sneak in two quick questions. I guess just on that en route mortality, it's clear to you that we need to keep making that adjustment, that management adjustment, and we need to be very careful and keen to observe how much more of that adjustment we may need in the future given climate change.
I agree with that.
All right. And then finally, I just need to I've just been given 5 more minutes. I just need to understand one more thing about how you've integrated your recommendations. And particularly, I'm concerned with some of the recommendations that we had an opportunity to discuss with Carl English and the sort of management recommendations that came out of his work and others. Was it your intention to try to summarize all of those into these recommendations, or were you more intending to summarize the work that needs to get on to really understand the long-term trend issue?
The latter.
Thank you. And so the development of methodologies to design and evaluate stock health and production frameworks and fisheries deployment work that needs to get done isn't so critical for understanding the long-term trend, but may be very critical for the sustainability of the sockeye salmon. You'd agree with that?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
I think that concludes my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Sylvia. Mr. Commissioner, John Galis for Western Central Coast Salish First Nations. Mr. Marmorek, just by way of background, I'll try and explain to you who the Western Central Coast Salish First Nations are. They're a group of First Nations mostly located on the east coast of Vancouver Island, sort of central down to Victoria area. There's also a First Nation with a community in Ladner that's part of that group as well. Their traditional territories, fishing areas, are in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Strait of Georgia, and the mouth of the Fraser River. Mr. Commissioner, I've given up some of my time to Ms. Gardner, and I expect that she's done actually a very good job of laying the groundwork for my cross-examination. So I think I will probably only be about 20 minutes and possibly less than that. Mr. Marmurick, I'm going to apologize ahead of time because some of the questions that I'm going to ask you may seem a little bit redundant. We've covered some of these areas before, but I just want to lay out some context, and then we can have some discussion around that. I'm mostly interested in your recommendations, but I want to go back to some key principles if I can. I'm only going to be referring to your report. So if we could go to page 6, Mr. Lynn. And just under 2.2, and I must apologize for this, but I want to look at this definition because I'm going to go back to it later. And it's the definition of cumulative effects assessment. And it specifically refers to the process in which the effects of a proposed project are assessed together with the effects of other past, present, or future projects to determine the overall cumulative effects on valued ecosystem components, VECs. Now, I know earlier that I think it was my friend Mr. Prowse took you to another definition of that, and we've been throwing this phrase around quite a bit, but you'd agree that your technical report, and I think you used the term retrospective cumulative effects analysis, that would more accurately describe what your report is?
That's one term, and the other was retrospective ecological risk assessment.
Now, if we just go back to page 5, right at the bottom.
Sorry, could I just make a comment on what you were just pointing to, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Just because it's a fairly important clarification here. So if we just go back to the section you were looking to, the first paragraph describes how cumulative effects assessment is generally done in Canada, and the second paragraph points out that there are problems with the way that's done.
Okay, thanks. And let's take a look at the things that come before that when we were talking about cumulative effects and ways of looking at cumulative effects. So at the bottom of page 5, you talk about there's sort of two kinds of analysis. I want to look at, if we go over to the next page, I want to talk a little bit about the second kind of analysis. So if we could just go there. So it's the first full paragraph on page 6. Now the second kind of analysis looks at how multiple effects might combine, i.e. how multiple stressors might interact to produce a combined impact different in form or magnitude from each stressor acting independently. For example, how might increasing ocean temperatures have affected predators, diseases, and parasites in a way that changes their overall impact? There are many ways in which individual effects might combine to form types of cumulative effects. Now, I want to explore that with you a little bit, that sort of analysis. And in cross-examination with Ms. Gardner, and I appreciate her setting the table for me on this, you agreed that although marine conditions and climate change were the primary drivers, that there other factors may have been at play. And I want to delve into this a little bit deeper with you.
That's fine.
Okay. So yesterday in evidence, you referred to marine conditions impacting on other factors, and I think you made a reference to low food abundance being one of those factors.
Yes, that's right. Low food abundance is generally considered more of a problem as sea surface temperatures go up for Fraser sockeye.
And also, I think there was a reference to possibly predators as well.
Right, some of the things that are mentioned here. That's right. They also change at the same, likely to change at the same time as temperatures get warmer. Fish that are normally found off the coast of California are more commonly found up in BC.
There was quite a bit of discussion we've had around climate change or global warming or global weirdness, I think is what a lot of the scientists are calling it now. And one of those impacts from climate change would be changes in ocean temperature. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and possibly salinity as well.
Mixing, salinity, pH, a bunch of things.
Okay. Now, I want to suggest, and please correct me if I'm wrong in this, that perhaps we can view climate change as a catalyst for, among other things, changes in ocean conditions.
I don't know if catalyst is the term. I mean, I think a key driver. Yeah, it's
Okay.
basically the same concept. Yeah.
So it's a key driver, a major contributing factor. You would agree.
Yes.
Just sort of going down that road. Changes in marine conditions could also act as a key driver, as opposed to a catalyst, for other factors. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
And the marine conditions and the climate change are interactive, as we talked about previously with Ms. Baker. They overlap.
So we talked about low food abundance would be one of those factors that may occur as the ocean gets warmer.
Right, both gradually over time and also episodically with an El Nino or year-to-year fluctuations.
Right. And then also increases in predators or new predators coming.
That could be increases or decreases. It could be changes in competitors as well as changes in prey.
Okay.
All of the above.
Colonization by invasive species, perhaps.
Also possible.
And also harmful algae blooms.
Yes.
How about development of pathogens?
So Dr. Kent in his report pointed out that pathogens are likely to become more common as temperatures increase. So I think it's reasonable to assume that in the areas where temperatures go up, you may be expected to see more pathogens.
When we're looking at designing a science project, would you agree that all of these factors need to sort of go into that basket? Given your findings that climate change is this major driver, these are the types of factors we should be looking at?
Right, and that's, as I was just discussing previously with your colleague, that's why recommendation number 9 talked about fully integrated oceanographic and ecological investigation on page 109.
Well, you're jumping ahead, but I might as well ask you that question now anyway. So, would you agree that as part of that project, that cumulative effects assessment would be one of the key, terms of reference, or one of the key approaches that one would have to take to complete that study?
Okay, so when you ask that question, cumulative effects assessment, as outlined by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Association, or agency rather, is not necessarily what we would recommend, because it's project focused rather than focused on the valued ecosystem component, in this case sockeye. So we would rather recommend that you were looking at cumulative impacts on the different life history stages of the valued ecosystem component. So what we call VEC focused rather than project focused.
I think we've still got it up there. Would the second kind of analysis more accurately characterize the
right, the
type of
paragraph
approach?
below the one that's under the beginning of section 2.2, so the second paragraph, Mr. Len, if you could just go down a little bit there. Actually, I think it goes on a little earlier. If you go down further, a little later, rather. So here we go. CEA should be focused on VECs rather than projects, because ultimately the cumulative effects on VEC sustainability are the effect of greatest concern.
Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about unknowns, unknowables, knowledge gaps, and data limitations. And I know that Ms. Gardner stole my thunder. I was going to reference this as a Rumsfeldian statement that you came up with. Let's go to that. It's on page 14 of your report. Now you've identified 3 challenges under this section. The first was data limitations, and I think we've beaten that horse to death, so I don't want to ask you about that one. And then there's the 2 others. The gaps in basic knowledge or understanding, and what you've termed as unknowables. The third challenge, we cannot know, that's the next page over, we cannot know the explanatory influence of a factor that has not been monitored in a given year or location. When there is no data, one cannot make any inferences either in favor or opposed to a given hypothesis. Now you've referred to that as an unknowable, and I suppose if we're doing retrospective analysis, we could use that term, but I guess if we're looking forward, that those sort of factors may become knowable?
If you have anticipated, for example, that some exotic species should suddenly appear and that you have a monitoring program which could detect that, then that becomes a knowable. If you didn't have a monitoring program which was capable of detecting that exotic species, and that's just one example, and it suddenly appeared, but you had no data around it to explain that, then you wouldn't know that it was there. So you couldn't use it as a explanatory variable in your analyses to explain why something was happening. So anyway, it's just kind of by definition. If you don't have any knowledge of something, you can't know what its explanatory importance is.
Okay. Now, the recommendations that you have in your report, and I think I'd like to go to page 109. I want to really focus on the marine conditions, given the interests of the folks that I represent. I want to ask you a little bit about whether, well, I'll just ask you the question, whether or not these recommendations that you've set out here address some of the challenges, those being numbers 2 and 3, and to what extent?
Actually, if you could stay down where you were, Mr. Lund, that's great, on the coastal migration stage, because I think that's the key one there. So the intent of number 9 is to get a good understanding, both in terms of breadth and depth, of the oceanographic conditions in the key environments along the coastal migration, so Strait of Georgia, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Johnstone Strait, and Queen Charlotte Sound. So the reason for that is that over time, just as has been done, motivated by the Cohen Commission, looking back to 2007 and what occurred that was anomalous, unusual in those years, in those locations, as we acquire more of that information, we'll be able to better understand, I think, or provide explanations for what causes better years or poorer years, just as Kim Hyatt had in the paper that we were talking about earlier. So I think that covers, fills some of the data gaps, so that I guess it would be the first and second of the 2 types of challenges. It's hard to describe which of the unknowables you would monitor, almost by definition.
And that's fair comment. I think you already answered this question, but would you agree that a cumulative impacts paradigm, and I'm not talking about the CIA, Canadian Environmental Assessment Act paradigm, should play or guide a role in these research projects that we've set out here, the 23 recommendations? Yes, very much so. Okay. Now, your report obviously identifies a number of gaps in science, and I know that you or your firm has worked a lot with First Nations and First Nations organizations. Is it your opinion that there's a role for traditional and local ecological knowledge? And if so, actually maybe I'll ask you that first question.
Yes, I believe there is a role.
So how do you see TLEC or tech being integrated into the scientific research projects you've identified as priorities?
Well, I think it's a very important form of knowledge, in particular because of the time span, both in duration and also in terms of resolution, namely that people, First Nations, have been in particular locations for a very long period of time, have seen many fluctuations in resources, have amazing memories about, well, hopefully recorded from elders and the like, about what's changed, but also because they're there all the time during a given year. So if something really unusual happens, oh, we had these really weird algal blooms in May, before any of you scientists got out there with your sampling gear, they're there. And so I think that, and in other work that we've done in the north and elsewhere, for example, in Tuktoyaktuk, Inuit noticed that the broad whitefish tasted funny long before anybody detected that there were some petrochemicals in them. Mm-hmm. So there are many examples like that. We did a report actually for the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council on additional ecological knowledge. Some of my colleagues did.
Yeah, I think we might be discussing that in our next panel. Finally, well, actually not finally, just taking off on the point, would you agree that given the conclusion around the ocean environment being a primary factor, that there is a role beyond TAC for First Nations to play in the science, so in the data collection as well?
Yes, I do agree with that.
Okay, thank you. We heard yesterday, and looking at your CV, you've had a lot of experience on the Columbia River. Perhaps in the brief time that we've got, maybe you could summarize what we might be able to learn from what's occurred on the Columbia River, and should we be cautious in adopting a Columbia River approach?
Well, I guess one recommendation I'd have, which isn't new because the Fisheries Research Board back in the early 60s wrote a report which said it's probably not a good idea to build big dams on the Fraser because they did that in the Columbia and they're having trouble. So I think that's pretty evident. There's obviously trade-offs there. I think one of the ironic benefits of those dams is that they now have pit tag detectors which can detect fish going over spillway, well, not going over spillways, but going through bypass facilities. And so they have very detailed information on life stage specific survivals. So from spawners to smolts before they get to the first dam at Lower Granite, and then from Lower Granite to the last or 8th dam at Bonneville, and then back. And that information's proven very valuable for disentangling freshwater versus marine versus combined versus delayed mortality effects. It's a lot of money, and in fact the power production generates the money that funds the Fish and Wildlife Studies, so there's a real trade-off there. However, I guess what I would point out is that you can learn a lot without spending quite so much money from like the kinds of life stage specific survival studies that are in Dr. Hyatt's report. So I think we can learn a lot from that kind of work that tries to identify where the bottlenecks are for different stocks in different locations. That's something that's been valuable from learning from the Columbia.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
For the record, it's Tim Dixon for the Stalo Tribal Council and Cham Indian Band. Mr. Marmarek, Ms. Gertner and Mr. Galis, just before me, have covered a lot of territory, some of which I wanted to ask you about. So my questions are going to be brief. And I just want to focus on one broad management implication of your report that I see. And that's how we respond to climate change. Because when we look at the stressors that you cover in your report, certainly, when we look at the stressors that you cover in your report, some of them we have quite a lot of control over if we chose to exercise it. And an example being, say, salmon farming. Others we have little control over. We might have some control over some kinds of marine conditions, but very little control over other kinds of marine conditions. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair. I think one of the implications, and perhaps we don't discuss it directly, is that even though you don't have any control over marine conditions, the fact that there can be a lot of variability in marine survival has implications for how you make other decisions. Like, for example, for the Barkley Sound stocks, harvest decisions are anticipated 2 years before based on conditions for outgoing smolts. So you can learn things that help you subsequently.
Yes, and you're going to have to respond to those marine conditions through such decisions as harvest management. That's exactly the point. Climate change, more broadly, is again a pattern over which we as a nation have extremely little control. That's fair, right?
Yes, I think that's true, though I like Al Gore's comment that political will is also a renewable resource.
Yes, I agree. And so a troubling conclusion of your report is that the kinds of changes over which we have relatively little control appear to be relatively responsible for the decline in productivity.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. The kinds of stressors over which we have relatively little control are relatively central to the decline in productivity, and there I mean marine conditions and climate change.
Right. Marine conditions and climate change we have relatively little control over, and they appear to have had a major effect. That's correct, yeah.
The point I want to focus on is that if we cannot prevent climate change and we cannot prevent some adverse changes in marine conditions, then it becomes crucial that we protect the ability of sockeye to adapt to these changes. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's correct, and to the degree that you can maintain diverse life histories and diverse habitats that potentially create, across all the stock complex, greater resilience to those varying conditions caused by climate change, and perhaps other actions. In the paper by Mike Healy, he lists a bunch. I think that paper's been circulated before.
Yes, I think so. But and that is the point that I want to drive to. That in the face of such things as climate change, it becomes more and more important to protect biodiversity, diversity genetically and of life histories and of habitats, the broad portfolio of stocks. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with it, and so do lots of others. There's a whole session on that, the American Fisheries Society conference earlier this month, and that was one of the key recommendations.
And just for the Commissioner, although I'm sure he has the point, if I can just bring up Exhibit 553. This is Project 9, Mr. Marmarek, Hinch and Martin's paper. And if you can go, Mr. Lund, to PDF page 35. Hinch and Martins are speaking to adaptation of Pacific salmon to climate change. And in the first full paragraph there, they just cite one of the best examples of phenological changes presumably arising through evolution in response to warming from the Columbia River, where sockeyes started their spawning migration earlier. And that's an example of a kind of response to climate change that is a successful adaptation. Successful to a point, anyway. Is that fair? I know it goes on to
it goes both ways, though. It goes both ways, though, because some of the earlier return behavior of some of the late runs in the Fraser may well have been triggered by unusual conditions as well, which is not a evolutionarily wise behavior right now. Coming back earlier when the temperatures are hottest in the summertime. So it can go both ways in the sense that some of the responses may end up being evolutionarily advantageous, but it could go in another direction.
Oh, absolutely. That's how natural selection works, isn't that right? I mean, there's broad variability and then
Yeah, I think
and
there's
then it
also-
selects for the successful.
And I think there's a
Adaptations.
limit to adaptation as well, given that sockeye are near the southern end of their range.
Yes, and that's discussed a little bit in Hinch and Martin's, but I want to take you to just one of their conclusions on page 33, I think the next page, Mr. Lund. And just at the bottom of that paragraph, they're describing management responses that could be adopted to better cope with climate change. And then the last few lines, they say adjust fisheries management practices so as to ensure the achievement of escapement goals and thereby the conservation of genetic diversity across stocks. For example, shift the focus from dominant to smaller stocks when adjusting escapement targets. And I take it you would agree with that as a prudent management response.
Well, that's an example. I think, as I said earlier in response to a different set of questions, I think if you're going to consider what are the best harvest management strategies for giving sockeye the best possible chance to adapt to climate change, you have to do some pretty thorough analysis of that. Like, I wouldn't want to just throw out a general principle without actually working that through for each of the stocks and the various life history timings and the expected direction of changes in temperatures and a bunch of other things like that. Some of these other reports that are mentioned here talk about other strategies as well, like a little bit higher. Yeah.
Right. In protecting biodiversity is one of the core objectives of the wild salmon policy.
That's correct.
Yeah, and it does that by defining conservation units according to genetic uniqueness, and then setting benchmarks, and then managing in response to those benchmarks. Is that
Yes, that's right.
a fair summary? And in broad terms, in your opinion, is managing according to CUs defined in that way, as opposed to managing according to larger aggregates, is that a prudent and sensible framework in light of climate change?
So there's two parts to this, and I think it's really important to tease apart those two components. So one is, if you would like Fraser sockeye to be the most resilient with respect to climate change, what is it you would like to do? And then the second part is, if you would like to maintain the objective of allowing harvest to various groups, commercial, recreational, First Nations, what is it you would want to do? And there are going to be trade-offs amongst those objectives with different policies. So the societal resolution of what's an adequate trade-off isn't a science question, it's a policy question.
Absolutely. And just going back on the first of those prongs, which is what I'm focusing on, if your concern is resilience in the face of climate change, your aim is going to protect biodiversity in the range of conservation units. Is that fair?
I think, as I said earlier, you would really need to work this through carefully based on what appear to be the relative sensitivity of different stocks. So if, for example, it turned out that the Chilco stock, I'm just saying this, I don't know if it's true, were far less sensitive to temperatures than, let's say, Stalaco or the early Stuart or something, then there might be a win-win there in terms
Yes.
of your adaptation to climate change and your ability to meet the harvest objectives. Okay. On the other hand, if it turned out that most of the major stocks were much more vulnerable to climate change and some of the weaker stocks had a lot greater ability, then that may suggest that maximizing your diversity is the best. So I think it's combining some of the work that Scott Hinch and Tony Farrell and others have done with things like the stock management harvest models and putting them together and seeing what the combined implications are is what we really need to do to explore what are the most robust strategies to all those uncertainties.
Right, and part of that is gathering more information about all the individual CUs.
Yes, I think that's right.
taking into account the available resources, and I heard your evidence on strategically choosing CUs to focus on, but certainly we want to gather information at the CU level.
Right.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I just have a couple of re-examination questions. The first one was when Mr. Timberg for Canada was asking you about comparing the Pacific Salmon Commission 2010 report with your report. He asked you if you agreed that the PSC report and your report came to similar conclusions, and you talked about a distinction that you would make based on more information that was available to you in doing your report. I just wanted to clarify that there was another distinction, was there not, in that the hypotheses that were looked at by the Salmon Commission workshop were actually, while they overlapped with what was looked at in your reports, they were slightly different. So there was some difference in hypotheses in the two projects. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. For example, the harmful algal blooms was not looked at in our report, but was examined in the PSC report.
And then, thank you. And then when Mr. Eidsvik, you remember, asked you a bunch of questions about changes, significant changes that had happened since 1992, and you ran through a list. And one of the changes he asked you about was whether there were large escapements with respect to Fraser River sockeye, and you agreed with that. Were all the stocks on the Fraser River system experiencing larger escapements in the 1990s or since 1992?
To look at that, what I'd really want to do, and I don't think you have time to do it, is to actually dig into the appendices of Peterman and Dorner's report number 10, and I think there was quite a bit of variation amongst the stocks in terms of what the escapements were, but I really have to look at that to answer that question well.
So you wouldn't agree that it's true that all stocks had large escapements? You'd need to go and look at the data.
I'd agree that I need to look at the appendix to answer the question in detail.
All right. And then when Mr. Prowse was asking you some questions about looking at different stressors in different areas, and you answered a question and you said you can look at contaminants and you can say, well, in certain pristine areas there were no contaminants noted, so we can kind of maybe rule out contaminants as being a big driver of declines in productivity, because you can compare a more polluted area like the Fraser with areas that are further up the coast which are more pristine. And I just wanted to clarify, when you're talking about contaminants in that context, you're talking about, I guess, contaminants that are generated at ground level. You're not really talking about atmospheric deposition of contaminants. Is that right? Because that would affect those pristine areas as well.
No, that's correct, and they have found atmospherically deposited contaminants, way up in remote Alaska areas and so on. I think the point here is the fact that declines have occurred in areas which we suspect have very low levels of contamination. We don't actually have the data. We didn't have the data for the non-Fraser stocks. Suggests that things other than contaminants are likely to be responsible for declines in productivity in those non-Fraser stocks. But that's not to say that contaminants, particularly those for which we don't have data, like the endocrine disruptors, had zero effect in the Fraser. You could have both things going on.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, those are all the questions I have for Mr. Marmorek. I had a couple of housekeeping matters I wanted to cover with you and council, which we don't need to have Mr. Marmorek stay for. So.
Well, I'm sure he'd be delighted to leave. So, Mr. Marmorek, thank you very much for your attendance yesterday and today, for answering the questions of council and myself, and for your assistance to this commission. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
And so, Mr. Marmorek can be excused, and you want to take care of a couple of housekeeping matters.
I did. We have two matters that are outstanding from today. One of them is a document that was marked for identification, and I'm wondering if we need to put some more structure around how we're going to deal with that, because we have such limited time. Looking at how that document was treated, it wouldn't be going in for the truth of the document. It goes in simply as a foundation to questions that were asked, and it's really the evidence that came from Mr. Marmorek, which is the evidence that is relevant and can have some weight attached to it. Given that it was, although Mr. Harvey didn't directly put it to him when he was answering his questions, it was clear that it was the document that was being referenced in the answers. I would suggest that should be marked as a full exhibit, and given how close we are to the end of hearings, I'm concerned about adding more time to the process and moving that forward. I know that you had indicated there may be other parties that would like to comment on that, but again, at the risk of it being extremely irritating, I would say that those parties who haven't shown up to the hearings, I'm not sure that we should be waiting on the process for them to weigh in on that issue. They are not here to weigh in on any other marking of exhibits when they're not in the room. So I would suggest we deal with that one first today. That would be my first point, which we could deal with, and then I have one other point.
Mr. Commissioner, I spoke to my client about this at the coffee break this morning and said that this issue would be coming up and I need to get instructions. I do not have any instructions with respect to that document, so I'm not in a position to take a position right now.
Which document are we speaking?
This was an email from Carl Walters to Mr. Marmer.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think what we could do, Ms. Baker, is Mr. Lunn will be sending out his usual reminder about the hearing on Thursday. And I would suggest that he could include in that notice mention of this document and the fact that, for one thing, Mr. Timber does not have instructions at this point, but that we will deal with it on Thursday pending any matter or any submission that a party wishes to make with respect to the document. And so we could cover it off in his notice to make sure people know that we're going to deal with it on Thursday.
Thank you. And then the last point is the document which was talked to, which Mr. Isaac talked to you about, which is the document which we say is privileged. And I have some concerns about how we proceed with this document. At the moment, it is a document. It hasn't been put to any witness. The author of the document has not been called. I cannot imagine what evidentiary weight could attach to this. It's not going to be able to be used for the truth of the document. It really has no evidentiary value at all, and I'm wondering if we really need to go through the process of submissions on the weight to be given to this document, its admissibility and everything else, given our very limited time and given the fact that I don't see in my submission how any weight can attach to this document in any event.
Ms. Baker, I don't think I disagree with your position on the privilege matter that you've raised with respect to its admissibility. I think, in fairness to Mr. Eidsvik, I can recall him suggesting that he had some position to take on the matter of privilege. He hasn't expressed that position to me, and nor I have not seen any submission in writing from him. So at this point in time, I don't think there's any need for me to deal with it. If Mr. Eidsvik wishes to raise the matter with some position or submission that I ought to address, then I will address it. But at the moment, I don't intend to deal with it until he takes some action with regard to expressing a submission or position on whether or not it ought to be admitted. I understand your position. He seems to suggest, at least he did today, that there was some answer to that position, but he hasn't expressed it. So at this point in time, it's not going to be marked, but I'm content that if he wants to raise it again, I'll see what he has to say.
Thank you. And then the last one hopefully won't irritate you, which is simply about Thursday morning. There's apparently a fire drill in the building that day, and we can't start until, I think, 10:45. People are going to be hopefully able to be back in the room with a hopeful start time of 11, I think is the message I'm supposed to communicate to the room.
Yes, I think I was forewarned about the fire drill. I'm not sure why it takes an hour, but apparently it does. It's the federal government. They take longer than the provincial government to organize fire drills. So I understand we're starting at 11, I believe, on Thursday morning, and we may sit a bit later that day to try to make up for lost time. I think that's Mr. Wallace's intention. Mr. Rosenblum seems to know something to tell me.
No, I don't know anything. In fact, this is the first I've heard of it. Why don't we start early that morning and then take our coffee break during this 1 hour fire drill?
I don't know the details, except I know that they'd been negotiating extensively with the building on this, and this was where they landed.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I just wanted to know, is for Mr. Lunn's benefit, will his notice with respect to the exhibit refer to written submissions or oral submissions?
I would prefer written submissions by Thursday than Mr. Harvey, if anybody has one they wish to submit. We'll have, I think, a full day on Thursday without this matter. So we'll leave it at council coming at 10:45 on Thursday morning so we can get underway as close to 11 as possible. Thank you all very much Appreciate it.
Hearing is now adjourned until Thursday at 11 a.m.